I'm a practicing lawyer, and I'm also very honoured to be Legal Affairs Director of the LA. I've been involved with the libertarian movement now for quite a few years as a polemicist, writer, ranter, general troublemaker. And being involved in the organisation for that time, you become very aware of its strengths and its shortcomings, as there are indeed strengths and shortcomings with any political or ideological movement. But as far as I'm concerned, one of the most regrettable and possibly damaging shortcomings that we have as a movement is that we consistently and grossly underestimate the tenacity and creativity of our enemies. We work very hard to knock down their straw man arguments, which we do with consummate ease, only to find that 2 or 3 have been erected in their place. It's like what the Americans call whack-a-mole, an arcade game where you hit one mole on the head and 2 more just pop up. We often feel we've reached a kind of empirical or ideological victory, only to find out that we've been outflanked, and lo and behold, we're back where we were before we started. I can remember exactly where I was when I first heard the term greenhouse effect. I was in my 2nd year of my law degree in Nottingham, and I was in my room and I was reading a magazine, and I stumbled across what seemed at the time a mildly interesting article about this atmospheric phenomenon known as greenhouse effect and how it could lead to something called global warming. And I thought very little about it. I thought it was mildly interesting, and that was it. That was 1981. Before the end of the decade, the green movement had captured a significant chunk of the political high ground, not just in Britain, but in Europe and even in the USA and throughout the developed world and much of the rest of the world as well. It was that quick. Now, 1 generation later, we have world leaders such as Tony Blair and Jacques Chirac and whoever, holding junkets in obscure places like Marrakesh and Kyoto with a view to drawing up legislation, regulatory legislation, to supposedly address the effects of global warming. It has grown that big in a generation, and of course I am not alone in having witnessed a lot of our previous enemies that we called Marxist or Leninist or socialist or communist or fascist in many cases, migrate from those bankrupt institutions into the new and vibrant and popular institutions of the modern green movement. It is therefore an extremely important issue for libertarians, classical liberals and even conservatives. How much truth is there in these claims? I'm not a scientist, I don't know. It seems to me that climatology is a perfectly legitimate area of inquiry, and we are affected by our climate. It is absolutely facile to suggest otherwise. How much truth is there? I don't know. We read shock reports in the newspapers, but to what extent are these just amplifications of the hegemonic agenda? To what extent are these just spooks that are useful to the ruling classes who can then raise taxes and hobble businesses on the base of it? I don't know. A man who does know more is sitting to my left, and the man who I have the pleasure of introducing to you all is Dr. Julian Morris.
No, I'm not a doctor.
You are now. You are now, and accept the gift gracefully. Dr. Morris is a director of the International Policy Network. I noticed that they have some very interesting looking brochures outside, so please do help yourselves to one on the way out or on the way in. He is based here in London, which is fortunate for us Londoners, and the aims of his organisation are to empower individuals and promote respect for people and property in order to eliminate poverty, improve human health and protect the environment. All very laudable. He is also a visiting professor at the University of Buckingham. He holds degrees in economics and law and is the author and editor of many papers and books, including long list, which I will not read out except to say that I'm obviously in esteemed company. So without further ado, I will introduce you to Mr. Morris, who is going to talk to us and tell us about exactly what is true and what is not in the environment game.
that, I think, apposite introduction, David. I'm going to begin with a series of myths and try and talk about the nature of the myth and contrast it with the realities. And I'll start with the myth that the environment is in crisis. Now, of course, the environment is not an entirely objective construct. What one person thinks of as the environment will be quite different from what another person thinks of as the environment. One could certainly contrast what a person sitting in this room today might think of as their local environment, or even the global environment, with what someone sitting in a tree in Papua New Guinea might think of as their local and global environment. Clearly, two very different things. Nevertheless, there arguably are some objective or quasi-objective measures by which we might evaluate the quality of the environment in some respects. And on those measures, in wealthier countries, by which I mean the likes of the UK, the US, Canada, Japan, and even France, the environment is significantly better than it was 30, 50, or 100 years ago. If you take as the relevant measure in these cases water quality, in terms of, for example, the level of coliform bacteria, the biological oxygen demand, which is the extent to which the water can allow fish and other aquatic life to live. If you take air quality, and especially measures of air quality, such as the amount of particulate matter, or sulfate aerosols, or nitrogen aerosols even more recently, then you can see a significant reduction in the amount of those chemicals in the atmosphere over the course of the past 30 years. And in terms of particulate matter, a massive, massive reduction over the course of the past 100 and 200 years. If you had lived in London in the mid-19th century, you could expect to have been subject to vast and unreasonable quantities of noxious soot, constantly invading your space during the winter time. That is clearly not the case today. So on that fairly objective measure, London and other cities in the United Kingdom, and in most other parts of the wealthier part of the world, the environment has clearly got a lot better. I'll talk about some of the other alleged claims about crisis later, but I mean, it's worth putting into perspective the fact that people now are living longer, that they are able to live in a much cleaner environment than they were previously. The second myth is that environmental harm results from economic growth, that there is a direct and causal relationship between those things. The reality is that if you look historically and cross-sectionally, you see that over time there is a rise in emissions of certain kinds of pollutant as economic growth takes place, up to a certain level, and then after a certain level, you see a decline. This is simply an empirical observation that's been done by a number of different studies, starting really in the early 1990s. This observation, which was called the environmental Kuznets curve, or the inverted U-shaped curve, is pretty much uncontested. And on average, taking a bundle of different pollutants, including the ones that I've already mentioned, the particulate matter, sulfur aerosols, nitrogen aerosols, coliform bacteria, biological oxygen demand, on average, taking a cross-sectional analysis, you see pollutants rising up to the level of, until average incomes reach approximately 5,000 US dollars in, I think, 1992 terms, so probably about 8,000 US now, and then falling again after that. So that's on average, and looking cross-sectionally at about 30 different countries. However, for certain specific pollutants, that the point at which you get a decline is slightly later, and the point at which you get a decline for other forms of pollutants is earlier. What that, I think, tells you is that people are prioritising action against certain kinds of pollutant. The ones that get hammered earlier on in the growth cycle are typically black soot, really horrible particulate pollution, and coliform bacteria. That's bacteria that results from too much sewage in the water supply. And those types of pollutant typically rise until about 2,000 US dollars and then fall again. And this is an indication, as I said, of people prioritising in fact, their health, I think. And furthermore, studies have been carried out looking at the general relationship between wealth and health. And you can see a fairly direct and strong correlation between rising incomes and increases in life expectancy, reductions in infant mortality. And both of those go along with two other things. One is a rise in nutrition per capita, and the other is a reduction in the extent to which water is polluted and the availability of sanitation. So you see people prioritising early on, improving their nutritional intake and improving the quality of water, things which are essential to live long and fruitful lives. Then, as they get wealthier, they start thinking about the other forms of harm that they can be doing to the environment and start taking action to reduce those. Much of that comes about from technological change, of course. So the shift from using wood and dung in poorly flued fires in mud huts to using coal, which is a more concentrated and more efficient fuel, and then using that in a more efficiently fired heating system, takes place as people get wealthier, are able to acquire capital, and are able to invest in those more efficient forms of energy. And of course, as markets develop, so specialisation takes place, and people have incentives to invest in and develop newer, more efficient forms of energy generation. So it is that over time, the environment improves along with economic growth, and there is I would say, a fairly direct and causal relationship between those two things. The third myth is that trade harms the environment, and this takes many different kind of forms. One of the dominant ones that's been around since the late 1960s is the idea that trade results in the endangerment of species. So in the mid-60s, the Worldwide Fund for Nature had as its emblem the rhinoceros, in addition to the panda, as a species that was being driven to extinction by people buying rhinoceros horn in Africa and trading it with people in Asia, and where it was sold as a fever suppressant, an antipyretic. But the question is, why might trade be reducing species numbers? If it's true that trade reduces species numbers, then why is it we don't see a massive endangerment of sheep and cattle? The fact that these species are traded in very, very large numbers suggests that trade itself cannot possibly be the cause of endangerment. No, it turns out that the cause is much more to do with the way that the species are managed locally and the incentives of those who are, in a sense, responsible for management. In Africa, and also in Asia, where the rhinoceros is to some degree prevalent, the ownership of the species, the ownership of the land on which that species and other wild species live, is not secure. I think that's putting it mildly. One only need look at what's been going on in Zimbabwe to see the sorts of problems that arise from a lack of secure ownership of property. Ironically, Zimbabwe, along with 3 other southern African countries, was actually a rather remarkable area in the past 30 years in terms of improving property rights structures. In South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia and Botswana, property over the wild resources was gradually vested in local communities and private individuals. And as a result, over that period, the incentives to conserve the local species generally improved quite substantially, to the point where, in fact, in some parts of southern Africa, the number of elephants has become quite problematic. Their numbers have risen so much. By contrast, in East Africa, especially in Kenya and Tanzania, property over wild resources was very insecure. It's got better recently, but it remains quite insecure. And specifically, the state has claimed for itself control over much of the wild species in those countries. And the local inhabitants, therefore, see megafauna, elephants and rhinos, as a threat. They conflict with the locals' desire to use their land for economically useful purposes, such as growing pineapples or whatever. And they shoot them. And then people take the whatever value they can get from those species. But trade, very definitely, was not the problem. And in fact, the ability to trade in the products of those megafauna actually provides an additional incentive to manage the resources sustainably. If people are able to own elephants and own the ivory which they're able to obtain from hunting or from culling elephants, if they're able to own the horn that they're able to obtain from rhino, and then they're able to sell it to people who are able to pay the largest amount for it, they'll presumably have a stronger incentive to conserve those species. Restrictions on that trade since 1973 in rhino and since 1989 in elephant have almost certainly contributed to the decline in those species in some countries. So, the conceptualization there is not only mythical, but it's absolutely counterproductive. The second area where trade is alleged to harm the environment is in the area of waste, and especially hazardous waste. So, for example, in the 1980s, Greenpeace waged a campaign against hazardous waste and called for the elaboration of an international treaty to restrict trade in hazardous waste between rich, or specifically OECD countries, and non-OECD countries. The premise of their argument was actually 5 instances of trade in hazardous waste, which had resulted in what they called illegal dumping in poor countries. An investigation of these 5 instances by David Montgomery established, however, that 4 of the instances were actually instances of plain fraud. A certain type of carton was being transported from a European country in general into an African country, and the label claimed that it was inert materials, whereas in fact it contained hazardous materials. We term this fraud. This is nothing more than fraud. Now, on top of that, the other instance, and indeed 3 of the 4 instances of fraud, also involved weak property rights in the country where the materials were being taken. So, basically, the government was allowing the dumping of materials without regard to the harm that it would cause to the local people. To suggest that an international agreement restricting trade in such materials between rich and poor countries would prevent deception and fraud of this kind and would somehow overcome the weak property rights regime in the country to which the waste was being transported is, I think, absurd. More so when one notes that one of the most significant instances of this trade was between Italy and Nigeria, 2 countries not known for upholding international law in any case. Clearly, this is again a situation where the rule of law in general and also the enforcement of contract and the upholding of property rights are much more fundamental to rectifying the situation than attempting to come up with international trade rules which might somehow limit the problem. A final area where trade is alleged to harm the environment relates to one of the things that David mentioned earlier, climate change, but also to various other environmental problems. It is claimed that transporting goods from one place to another is somehow inherently a bad thing. It's somehow inherently going to cause some harm to the environment. And it is proposed, and it has been proposed, it has to be said, for at least 40 years by kind of localists, the environmentalists who want to make everything local, that literally that trade be limited in the most extreme way possible, and everyone grow everything and produce everything locally. Well, taken to its logical conclusion, this would mean we would have to produce everything for ourselves in our backyard. Now, this is exactly what we've been moving away from for the past 10,000 years. And it's been rather good for us, as you can see. We've been moving away from an essentially closed-loop system, which is a bit like sort of putting yourself in diapers and hoping that it'll all sort of come back to you somehow, towards an open-loop system where you produce one thing in one place and another person produces another thing in another place and you trade away. Wonderful, fantastic. And of course it creates incentives for innovation and the generation of new, better, more wonderful things that use fewer resources and produce less pollution. Generally, the assertion that moving things from one part of the world to another is a bad thing is clearly ridiculous. I suppose one could come up with sort of other extreme examples, pointing out that even in specific cases, such as the emission of carbon dioxide, you will often get trade being lower pollution. 2 examples come to mind. One is growing bananas. Now, it is clearly going to be the case that if you're growing bananas in large amounts in Africa and transporting them cheaply by ship to Europe, you will be producing less CO2 than if you try to produce them in fossil fuel heated greenhouses in Scotland. Likewise, so it is the case with the production of aluminium. It is much more efficient to produce aluminium wherever electricity is cheapest, because the method for producing aluminium is by electrolyzing bauxite, which is a very, very electricity-intensive process. So if you can do that in a place, for example, where you have hydropower, which produces, at least at the margin, no CO2, or almost no CO2, then transport the aluminium to the markets where it's needed, you will be using and producing less CO2 than otherwise would be the case. Myth number 4, reduce, reuse, recycle. This is a wonderful mantra which we still hear occasionally and actually is the basis for much of what goes on in DG Environment in Brussels, because there they believe in the waste hierarchy, which is exactly this: reduce, reuse, recycle. The question is, well, actually there's several questions. There's three specific questions. Firstly, if economic growth is good for the environment, as I've argued, then why do we want to reduce consumption? Consumption is part of this whole economic growth process, and we don't want to reduce things. We actually want to increase them because it's good for us, good for the environment. Secondly, there actually may well be trade-offs between reduction and recycling. So, for example, it makes sense in some cases to recycle high-value items, things such as aluminium, which is, as I've already mentioned, expensive and resource-intensive to produce, and glass, which is likewise quite resource-intensive in its production. So it may be worth recycling those things at some level if you can concentrate the recyclate enough and transport it cheaply enough to the recycler. However, many of those heavy and energy-intensive items have gradually been replaced by much lighter and less energy-intensive items. Both aluminium and glass have to some degree been replaced by plastic and laminate, plastic bottles and laminate packs, which can store things in many cases just as well. I noticed just a couple of weeks ago that a French wine producer has started selling wine now in laminate packs, which I think is an interesting innovation. And they say that this actually stores the wine better than in glass bottles with corks. So that's just a prosaic example. You've also seen a shift, for example, from especially copper wires to fibre optic cables for the transport of information over long distances. Now, this is a shift from an energy-intensively produced and relatively rare metal, copper, towards almost a ubiquitous resource, silicon dioxide, which is what glass is made of, what the fibre optic cable is made of. And it's led to a massive increase in the efficiency of transfer of information because fibre optics can carry much more information per unit area, and also it's much cheaper. However, if we had premised our assumption on reduce, reuse, recycle, would we actually have got there? Because maybe we would have just tried to use less copper or something like that. And of course, when it comes to reusing things, well, we do this every day. We do this with our cars, our coats, and our cats. We don't throw these away when we get home. Or at least, I hope you don't throw your cat away when you get home. Anyway, but there comes a time when these things are no longer productive, when they're no longer what you want. They cease to function properly, or they go out of style. In those cases, get rid of the things. You don't want to reuse them again. And this obsession with reuse, I think, doesn't make sense. It's really not an environmental concern. It's a moral thing. The people who argue for the waste hierarchy, for the reduce, reuse, recycle, are really saying don't buy things. Consumption is bad. We must all live as kind of ascetic a lifestyle as we can. The fifth environmental myth is acid rain. Not much talked about these days. Very much a concern in the 70s and 80s. Made the headlines a lot. Then, during the 1980s, someone decided to do some research. well, that's a bit unfair. Research had been done in the 60s and 70s, but it was laboratory research. And it had been observed that if you put a weak concentration of nitric or sulfuric acid in a petri dish with a seed, that seed, it won't germinate particularly effectively, or if it does germinate, it won't grow as well. In practice, as this very, very detailed long-term studies show, acid rain is largely a non-problem. There are some exceptions, but in the US and in most of Europe, acid rain did not lead to tree die-off. And I'll talk about this by relating a story from Julian Simon, who gave one of the most interesting talks on environment that I've ever been to in 1994 here in the UK. And he opened by talking about the way that the environment had been conceptualized by the scientists who had been asked the question, are the trees dying? First of all, the government went and asked the scientists to understand the leaves. The topic. Tree scientists come in different varieties, and then people understand the leaves, and then people understand the roots. And the officials went to the leaf scientists, and they said, and he said, what's the problem? And the leaf scientists said, well, there isn't a problem here. The problem must be with the roots. And so the officials went to the root scientists and said, well, what's the problem? And the root scientists said, well, there isn't a problem here. The problem must be with the leaves. And I think this illustrates the problem of an excessively narrow focus. That people, when they understand their own area, often don't understand the broader scheme of things. So the reality, of course, is that there was not a problem. But because the question had been posed in such a way, and the scientists themselves had framed the issue in such a way that there must be a problem, they still asserted that there was a problem, just not with the area that they were an expert in. There is a lot of evidence that there is acidification of lakes. Most of the acidification of lakes in Northern Europe and in the region around the Great Lakes in the States is a result of reforestation. What happened in the early parts of the 20th century in Northern Europe is trees were chopped down for use as firewood, as boats, as et cetera, and of course paper manufacture. Over the course of the 20th century, they were replanted. Now, pine needles, when they break down, are acidic, and the acids that were in the pine needles leached into the rivers. So actually what had happened is in the early part of the 20th century, the lakes had been alkalized, made less acidic by the reduction in pine needles falling into them. And it was in the late 20th century they were actually brought back to where they were in the beginning. Which brings me to my sixth myth, which David's myth. Climate change. The myth to end all myths. Actually, climate change isn't a myth. Climate change has been happening forever, for at least 5 billion years on this planet, and for many different reasons. And global warming has happened, and so has, more often in the past few million years, global cooling. And I remember a few years earlier than the 1981 paper by David referred to, 1976. Do you remember that really incredibly hot summer? 8 weeks of intense heat, of totally blue skies. And I remember in the middle of that summer, a story in the newspapers and on the television that the next ice age was just around the corner. 1976, the next ice age is just around the corner. And I was 7 at the time, so I wasn't too aware of all this. But I did think at the time this is weird. You know, why are they telling us that an ice age is coming when it's so hot? And so perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised when 12 years later the global warming claims started predominating. But the reason why there was a scare about global cooling in 1976 was that for the previous 30 years, there had been a slight cooling trend. That the Earth had according to the data available, had been declining in temperature. But after that, it started getting a bit warmer again. Now, there's too much that one could say about the discussion about global warming, and I've been told that I only have 3 minutes left. So maybe I'll answer specific questions in questions in Q&A. But needless to say, we're now living in a world that fears climate change. Week before last, I was at a lunch meeting at a venue in London. Unfortunately, it was under Chatham House rules, so I can't tell you where or who was speaking. But I asked the speaker, who was fairly eminent, and he'd just been giving a talk about why we've got to take action against climate change. And I asked him, well, you want to take action against climate change, but and you said that there are these certain things that are going to happen when it gets warmer. But we also know that when it gets warmer, there might be benefits. For example, the trade routes to the Arctic might be opened up. Generally, in warmer climates, especially when it's warmer in the winter, fewer people die of cold. So the question, and since it hasn't, the temperature hasn't remained constant over the past 2,000 years. In fact, it was probably warmer 1,000 years ago. The question was, what is the optimal temperature? Do you know the optimal temperature, and how are you seeking to achieve that optimal temperature? And I'll leave that as my little cryptic question relating to climate change. And my final myth in my one remaining minute is biodiversity. Well, the biodiversity myth really began in 1979 when Norman Myers wrote The Sinking Ark, in which he assumed that 1 million species would go extinct in 25 years. And that figure, which translates to 40,000 extinctions a year, has now become sort of fact in the context of the biodiversity debate in among certain people. There's actually no evidence to support it. We actually don't know within an order of magnitude, the number of species on the planet. And we don't know the rate at which they may or may not be dying off. We do know that there has been a significant change in the available habitat for a lot of species, and we do know that there are many species in rainforests. However, we don't know what the impact of marginal encroachments are on those species. The models that we use to predict extreme rates of death have been shown to be wrong, and so there's been a lot of revision recently. What we do know is that there are ways of reducing the rate of habitat encroachment that are consistent with classical liberal ideas. And those are the ones that I've talked about earlier, improving the ownership of property rights, enabling people to contract with one another. If these are allowed to exist effectively, then people engage in more efficient agriculture, so they don't slash and burn, they don't encroach so much, and they also have incentives to conserve for the provision of services and goods to others. I'll end it there. Thank you.
A bit sort of heavy on carbon dioxide. I don't know whether it's intentional. I found linked to the Lomborg site a paper from some American institute which looked pretty impressive to me, taking 38 species allegedly threatened in general, and 37 of them, according to this article, well referenced as far as a non-biologist could tell, 37 of the 38 A, we're doing better and better. B, the more carbon dioxide there was about, the even more better and better they were doing. And C, the more heat there was around for any given level of carbon dioxide or any given increase in the amount of carbon dioxide, the better and better still they were doing. So having heard Maya Hillman a fortnight ago saying carbon dioxide is going so fast that unless we abolish not only planes and cars, but even trains, we'll all suffocate to death within 25 years. I can't help wondering, maybe carbon dioxide is good for us, just like nuclear radiation is?
Qualify your last point. I mean, probably at low levels, nuclear radiation has a hormetic effect. But carbon dioxide clearly is essential to life on Earth. It's one of the significant trace gases known as the greenhouse gases, which contribute to raising the average temperature from minus 22 to plus 15 Celsius, which means that we can live here. Rather than on an icy mass. It is unclear what a significant increase in carbon dioxide is going to do to the planet. A doubling of carbon dioxide is estimated to lead to something between 1 and 10 Celsius increase in the temperature, depending on who you talk to. The more plausible estimates are between 1 and 2.5 Celsius for the planet, maybe less. Dick Lindzen argues that there is some kind of balancing mechanism which occurs because the rise in carbon dioxide leads to an increase in the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, and that can help reflect incoming solar radiation, as well as act as a blanket. So depending on where how the water vapor makes itself apparent. But I mean, like I said, we don't know what the optimal level of carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, just as we don't know what the optimal temperature is. Of course, in addition to being essential as a greenhouse gas, of course, carbon dioxide is a fertilizer for plants. We wouldn't have any plants on the Earth if we didn't have any carbon dioxide. So yeah, good point.
Well, I'd like to make two very quick points. First of all, I want to see the environment abolished. I define the environment as that part of the world nobody owns. And I want to see ownership increase so we get rid of the environment. Then property rights will solve the problem. The laws of property, of negligence, of nuisance, of strict liability will all come in, we will solve the problem. Second point, if we are damaging the environment, which I do not concede, let's go on doing it. I don't believe everything that Disraeli said, but he made one very good comment. Why should we do anything for posterity? What has posterity done for us? Chairman, I believe in trade. I believe in trade. I believe in trade. You cannot trade with posterity. These problems are much better solved by posterity. Let's leave it to them.
Yeah, John Lawler.
Two quick points. One is, have you read Michael Crichton's State of Fear? I find it has a very good thesis in it. I know it's a novel, but actually all the information is based on NASA material, ICPP, the International Group sort of Climate Change Monitoring System. But it explains it from the point of view of people who actually might be interested in it, because it actually has a lot of graphs and everything. But the ideas behind it, the sort of fake conversations with actors and everything who are like the George Clooney types and Michael Moore and all the people who have sort of really genuine, open-hearted people. But it sort of explains it from that point of view. But that if you look at the records going by, the records used as a comparison to show climate change are actually highly unreliable. And when they use sort of more reliable countries, such as like non-communist countries and everything, the climate change has not quite been shown. But could you comment on the issues that since 1979, more advanced ways of measuring global temperatures, such as weather satellites and sort of a higher level technology than that, has not shown any growth in temperature, considering since the 40s, for example, there's been a massive growth in carbon dioxide, but yet it has not been shown as
set of questions. First, yes, I've read State of Fear, great book. The temperature records that are used by the IPCC and others to assert that there's been this rise in temperature over the past 140 years are mostly ground-based thermometers and some water-based, so people plonking buckets into the ocean. The ground-based thermometers, many of them were located initially on the outskirts of towns. Towns have grown, and there is a thing called the urban heat island effect, which results in an increase in temperature in urban districts because the heat is trapped. And so as towns have grown and gone out towards the thermometers, so the thermometers have recorded an upward bias. Supposedly the Jones-Wiggley data that's used by the IPCC for this has factored that out. I suspect that it probably hasn't. They're very reluctant to give out their data sampling and manipulation methods, so it's difficult to tell. Also, there's an interesting difference between the temperature in the US that is recorded using the Jones-Wiggley data and the temperature recorded by the National Centre for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, which shouldn't exist, and that you'd expect the two to be the same, especially over the course of the 20th century, but you actually find that the Jones-Wiggley data biases the temperature in the 1930s in the US downwards, creating an upward trend. So there's some questions over that data. There's questions over data that's come from the former Soviet Union. I mean, during the Soviet era, people had a strong incentive to bias downwards temperatures in winter because they would then get more fuel. Quite a lot of perversities in the system that mean that probably the ground-based temperature record is not brilliantly accurate. The record of from the oceans has been problematic, and in fact, a couple of years ago, they had to make a correction which changed the change in temperature over the past century by about 1/4 degree Celsius, which is a pretty massive shift. Then you asked about radiosondes and satellite recorders, which agree with one another more or less. The radiosondes are the balloons that are put up, or the equipment on the balloons that are put up for weather stations. And then there are satellite records where you're using infrared radiometry to evaluate the temperature of molecules, the vibrations of molecules. Much more accurate than ground-based records, and you can get a global picture, whereas you can't really very easily with the ground-based records. And they show a very moderate warming since 1979. They were showing a cooling until about 7 years ago, and it's only very moderate warming. So it seems that you've got a data problem there, and that I think throws into extreme doubt the plausibility of the models which are predicated on the ground-based data. So yeah, quite agree.
Okay, I've got Tim Evans, and after that, Mark Henry Glendenning. Tim Evans, please.
Julian, yesterday morning I moderated a session and I mentioned some of the think tanks, the activist groups in Europe on our side, and I said that I thought your organisation, IPM, was one of the most outstanding. You do a phenomenal amount of good work, particularly against some of the so-called NGO and activist networks that operate with the WTO and all kinds of global organisations that seem to be captured by elements of that. Could you just describe, for the benefit of some of the work you do and some of the successes you've had, because you really have had some amazing achievements, and it'd be great for just people briefly to hear some of that.
Delighted. Thanks, Tim. I feel like I'm doing a bit of self-promotion now. But, well, I started IPN in 2001. The motivation for establishing it was the concern that our opponents were very coordinated in their attacks on free markets globally, and were organising themselves to generate global regulations and local and regional regulations that would be harmful to the individuals in society, to the sovereignty of nations, and so on. So, starting in 2001, we developed a set of programs working in fields that we felt were most being subject to this attack, especially the environment, health through the World Health Organization and other areas, trade and technology, the four main areas that we work. But I'll speak briefly about two fun things that we've done, so that you can get a sense of the sorts of things that we do. A lot of what we do is sort of boring in the sense of it involves research and writing and publishing op-eds and so on. But in 2002, we ran a campaign around the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which involved putting together some intellectual materials. So we had intellectual ammunition, and that resulted in a book called Sustainable Development, Promoting Progress or Perpetuating Poverty. We then put together a network of groups from around the world, which involved especially Leon Lowe's group, the Free Market Foundation, in South Africa. And actually in March of 2002, Leon and Kendra Okonsky, who works with me, and I took a trip from, actually no, it wasn't in March, it was earlier, it was in January 2002. We took a trip from Delhi to the Taj Mahal, and on the way back we went through Agra, which is a very, very poor town near the Taj Mahal, and we saw the most horrendous poverty there, and that inspired Leon to write an amazing piece, which actually I'll let him describe if he wants to. But the other thing that happened was that we discussed ways of challenging the environmentalists at the World Summit, and we came up with the idea of having a march on the summit. And Leon, working with other colleagues locally and to some extent with us in London, put together a plan. First of all, went to some tribespeople, thinking it would be fun to have people marching with tribal gear and so on, calling for freedom to trade and what have you. That didn't work out. But Leon's for 20 years had a very good relationship with the informal business people of Johannesburg and around, the people who hawk their materials on the streets, amongst other things. And as a result, he was able to persuade these people who had been unceremoniously thrown off the streets for the summit to make it look cleaner. He was, without too much difficulty, I should say, able to persuade these folks to come and march with us and promote the idea that if development is truly to be sustainable, then there's got to be some of it, and you're only going to get it if you allow freedom to trade. And so we had 700 people marching for freedom to trade into Sandton, the big northern Joburg suburb where the summit was taking place. We had coverage by CNN, BBC, Reuters, you name it, they covered it. Downstream, most of the intellectual participants in this, so the people who are working with IPN as partners, whether it be the Free Market Foundation from South Africa or the Liberty Institute in India, also got attention to themselves, not least because Baron Mitra of the Liberty Institute awarded two lumps of elephant dung to Vandana Shiva, and it was called the Bullshit Award for Sustaining Poverty. I'll wrap it up there, as I think that's giving you a flavour of what we do, and also linked into the environment later. Okay.
I think we've now, well, now definitely I've probably overrun
and I can't charge overtime, at least that's not in my contract. So I'm going to have to call this particular section of the proceedings to a halt, but I think on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank Julian Morris for a fascinating